Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus and his mission to reach people with the gospel and then to equip his people to worship and serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. Well, here we are talking about the Reformation, and today we're getting into the first generation reformers. But before we do that, hey Seth, how are you?
Is that what you put on your Reformed
It
Seminary
is.
sweatshirt? I wondered. Yeah. Came prepared.
There was thought. So last episode we looked at the proto-reformers, and one of the big parts of the proto-reformers is the development of the university system. And one proto-reformer, John Wycliffe, who was a professor at Oxford, so I wore my Oxford hoodie.
There we go. So
I did not go to Oxford, by the way. I visited Oxford.
You've been to Oxford.
I have been to Oxford, yes. Been to Oxford.
Today Reformed Seminary.
Yes.
For the Reformation.
For the Reformation. I did go to Reformed Theological Seminary, which to most people means absolutely nothing. And that's okay.
But to you, it means a lot.
But to me,
it means a lot.
Yeah. It's my alma mater. So anyway, but yeah.
Sorry, I'm good. I just had to. I made that connection while you were doing the little introduction there. I'm doing well.
Yeah,
doing well.
Tremendous. Here we are, ready for it. Okay, so with that,
let's jump in.
First generation reformers. Before we get into the people themselves, we need a little bit of historical context. So most of the time now, and again, this is this is one of the tricky things about how history works, especially church history. People like simplicity because that's easier, obviously, unless it's too simple, in which we don't. But anyway, you in order to understand the story, you need to understand what's going on behind the story or coming up to the story. And so part of that was last time looking at what's going on. When we talk about the Reformation proper and looking at the first generation reformers, we really have to back up to what's happening in the world just before the Reformation. And what's happening in the 15th century, that is the 1400s. What's going on there is actually one of the greatest technological, economic, political developments in Western history. The soil out of which the Reformation was even able to grow, is actually the Renaissance. Or European friends say it. So a few things, just to kind of like get in the frame of mind of what's going on leading up to the Renaissance. First and foremost, we have, this will be brief, I promise, but we have to back up to at least the 1000s. Very briefly. First, Great Schism, 1054, Eastern Church breaks with the Western Church. See our previous podcast on the church, for the church. So there's that split. There is also during this time the Crusades, just a little thing known as the Crusades. There is, conflict between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans with the Muslim forces of the day. Again, another wildly complex situation. I'm not going to broad brush that too much other than to say the Crusades happened, which they did, and we can leave it at that. But one of the things that happened with the Crusades is the development. There was, in the midst of conflict, there was cross-pollination actually between Muslims and particularly Western Christians. Here's a strange little known fact. Universities. We think of the first universities, obviously. The University of Paris, the Sorbonne, or Oxford University. Those are the oldest European universities. They are not the oldest universities in the world. The university system is actually not even really a European invention. It was a Muslim invention. Yikes. The Muslims of the really 9th and 10th centuries were developing the university systems. Granted, they looked a fair bit different, but one of the things that they were doing at this point in time, in again the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, Muslims during that day were actually studying two people in particular, one maybe more so than others, which the Western Church was not, and his name was Aristotle, who we don't think of as somebody that Muslims would study typically, but in early Islamic history or in early medieval history, Western Christians had honestly almost no interaction whatsoever with Aristotle at all. And really, even throughout much of the medieval era, there wasn't much study of Aristotle because there was conflict between the East and the West. And so Western Christians who speak Latin looked at the Eastern Christians and are like, anything Greek is garbage. Get that out of here. I don't like any of that stuff. Well, Aristotle happened to write in Greek, and he was not translated into Latin until much later. But in and around the time that the Crusades are going on, the Muslims do take over the Byzantine Empire fairly early, and there's a lot of conflict there.
The Byzantine Empire, for those of us who are...
Yes. Yeah. Eastern, originally in what was then known as Constantinople, is Istanbul today. And what was going on there, Alexandria, Egypt would quickly be picked up. Again, another staple of Greek and Hellenistic learning. And when the Muslims take over those places, first Alexandria, then Constantinople, what do they find in those places of learning? They find Plato and Aristotle, which are quickly translated from Greek into Arabic and are studied. But what are we studying in the West? Not Aristotle. Other things, good things, but not Aristotle. And so anyway, Crusades happen, and things continue on. This university systems, they're like, well, that's a
good idea.
That's a decent idea. We like that. We're going to carry that with us. We can do this in our great cathedrals, and they do it in the mosques, and we can build out the cathedrals and have this sort of educational system. And this is good. Maybe take some of what Charlemagne said back even earlier. And so they take all of that. It's a hodgepodge. They build out these things called the universities. And begin studying theology in a little bit more of a philosophical, academic sort of way. And so there's this development that's going on. Also, again, there's still aggression and conflict between Eastern Christians and Muslims. And eventually the Muslims take over. And in order to preserve the ancient texts, much of those ancient Greek texts are sent Eastern or Western into the Western part of Europe, along with the Greek-speaking Christians, in order to keep them from being taken or burned or something like that. That is not only ancient Christian writings in Greek, but also classical works on philosophy and mythology. Well, it's especially during the high and late medieval era, the Western Christians, this is terrible, but the Western Christians say, hey, we like your literature, but we don't like you. So we'll keep your books, but you can get lost. Bye. And so they keep the books and put them in the libraries, which were ever growing in the West, and they begin to study them. Increasingly so. And shortly about this time, again, the university systems are building more and more. It's built around libraries. They're getting more of these ancient works from the Eastern European world. And so they're growing. And then suddenly, instead of the scriptoriums where you have these monks just writing out long books by hand, they think, well, we got to develop something to mass produce books. And so they do. The Gutenberg press is invented, and now we can mass produce books and therefore mass produce potential for knowledge. And so books become something that's much more accessible. And these ancient works of antiquity in Greek, particularly, become more accessible. And so a study of not only classical Latin, but also Greek becomes something that Western thinkers in academic settings become interested in. And not simply for the sake of theology, but maybe even more so for the sake of philosophy. And there's a development, what was known as humanism, or the humanities. The study, not so much of theology for theology's sake, but the study of people and sociology and philosophy, how people think, how people work, where people went, different cultures.
And there's a difference between that and like what we think of as secular humanism today.
Yes.
So it's a more of a, what we would consider probably more like a liberal arts.
That's exactly
kind of
right.
Studying.
Yes.
Not
yes.
like the post-Enlightenment humanism.
Yes, and exactly right. Yes, in secular humanism, people are the best, but people are kind of all that there are. So, implication, who knows? Do what makes you feel good. I don't know. But humanities during this time, there's a shift within the university system of, and this is somewhat where the term comes from. Instead of the really core of what we're studying being either law, medicine, or theology, primarily theology, we're going to study not so much the sacred text as much as the human text. So again, works of poetry and works of history and all of these things. And so that's the development of this. And one of the mantras of that, kind of this rallying cry for this kind of new, like it was cutting edge to study some of these ancient writers, but to do so in the original languages. Not because during the kind of throughout the medieval era, the core of study being theology, what everybody did, they studied one guy's text. In the early-ish medieval era, there was a guy at the University of Paris, wrote a book. His name is Peter Lombard, maybe the nerdiest of all the nerds to ever nerd. Wrote a book called The Four Sentences that really became the staple. This is the work of systematic theology in the medieval era. And in order to get your doctorate in theology, or really even to study theology, you just studied Peter Lombard's Four Sentences. And so everybody writing in the medieval era, by and large, even up to the time of Luther, is just writing your dissertation was writing a commentary on Peter Lombard's Four Sentences. Well, now it's broadened out. Now, what will our studying be? Our study will be not simply Peter Lombard's Four Sentences, but Peter Lombard's Four Sentences along with Plato's Republic, or Aristotle's, Nicomedean ethics, and hey, why not? Let's throw some Plotinus in there. Oh boy, Neoplatonism. And so we get all of these things, and the rallying cry was ad fontes, to the sources, to the fount, to the fountainhead, where it all started. Let's go back to the original and come downstream. And this was just revolutionary, cutting edge, and part of this was the development of technology during this time. And so when you have this development of technology and new fodder for ideas, suddenly there's a vast, kind of growth in how do we think about the world. And so even leading up to before the time of Luther in the early 16th century, but before that, there are lengthy debates, even on the nature of what is actually real and true, people get shocked by this. Get ready to get shook. Okay? Get ready to get shook. One of the great debates, we'll talk a little bit about this more on a later podcast, but like one of the great debates is during this time, is what is real. And there was a very prominent group that was, in fact, even initially influenced on some of the circles that Luther ran in, but very, very popular, condemned by some, but very popular nonetheless, that says, what can we truly know in a universal sense? Nothing. What we would call relativism today, and it's a little different from what we'll see, was going on and being talked about in the 13 and 1400s at length. People were talking about, what can you truly know? Like know it. And there's a whole school of thought going, nothing. So just do your best. I don't know. Do your best, I guess. And so that was a huge debate. And so just that concept there was even a conversation like that, where you have some who are like, well, we know there are universal truths. There is a natural order to things, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are true concepts that we can know. And, we think that that's the medieval era, and certainly that's part of it. But there was this other group that was like, nope. Big time nope. And then to throw on top of that, you've got a whole nother group going on at this point in time. Is like, can we know anything or not? Who cares? The big goal in life is to have an experience of the celestial. Mysticism is also going. And so there's in the kind of Renaissance, what is on the table for being questioned? Literally anything. And so it's in that way that actually, really, when we get down to it, particularly in the Renaissance, throughout medieval era into the Renaissance, the culture of the day is not dissimilar to ours, which I think should be encouraging. That, hey, you think this is crazy? You really think this is crazy? How about Italy circa 1420? Crazy. Okay. So that's what's going on during the Renaissance. By the way, political unrest. The Holy Roman Empire, which again, largely from, the Carolingian Renaissance, Charlemagne, all of that is really being called into question. Everything's being called into question at this point. What is solidly under our feet as stated fact? The time just before Martin Luther is born, there is nothing established.
As we talked about in our previous episode, the church is being questioned.
Yes.
Just in terms of, not just like theologically, but like in terms of corruption, in terms of everyone, even within the church, is saying, someone's got to give. We got to do something here because something's not working. Right.
And you can almost feel the during the time of the Reformation you can feel even in the theology, people are like grasping hard for something tactile, in fact, even. So how the narrative is often told is one or two things. On the one hand, you've got, we had Thomas Aquinas, and everybody was Thomistic. That is a follower of Thomas Aquinas. The whole medieval, from high Middle Ages onwards, we're all just, to use a Murray County-ism, Muletown of the world, we're all G-hauling together here, okay? We're doing our Thomas Aquinas thing, but papal infallibility, transubstantiation, like nobody's even questioning, and we're all having a good time. We're all in one accord, driving our Honda down the road, man. That's right, having a good time. We're sharing the aux cord because we all like the same tunes, right? Like we're all into the same stuff. It's great. Nobody's questioning anything. And then Martin Luther shows up because he wanted to be a jerk. And that's just not true. And then on the other hand, we've got the whole like, everything is oppressive. Nobody had heard a distinguishing word in the church or seen anything good in the church for 1,000 years. And you know, it's just a homogenized, unified front against all that is good and true and right in the world. And then our glorious Savior, Reformer Martin Luther shows up and saves the day. And it's like, well, that's not exactly it either. The day and age leading up to it is that everybody is looking around going, something's got to give. The terra firma on which we stand might not be there in the next second. What we think of ourselves as citizens of this group could change tomorrow. Will we go with this influential group or this influential group or this influential group? All of which are debating each other. Who knows? And who will have the final say? Who knows? What are we just trying to do? We're just trying to make it into this new class known as the middle class, who have the benefit of being independently wealthy and not in charge of a country and living happily ever after. For crying out loud. Leave us alone, they say. And so you can see, like, even that, the development of the mercantile class, the middle class as we call it today, these independent former farmers are now sometimes even more wealthy than the monarchy, but without nobility and without a noble title, royalty. And so that's turning everything upside down, and people from that group are sending their kids to get education in this humanity, to get new skills and to take on this whole new world. It is a brave new world in some sense. And so you can feel the unrest on every side, religious, political, economic. The way that the world used to work is not actually that way anymore. So what's going to happen? Well, let's fast forward to a little guy named Martin Luther.
Not very little.
Not very well. I can't remember how tall they said he was. I think he was either average height or slightly below average height, and in his early days was probably a fairly thin man because he always had digestional issues. But then he married just one of like the coolest ladies of all time, Katrina von Bora, who apparently was a pretty good cook and a pretty good brewer, made some pretty good beer, and in his later years, Marty Luther plumped up. But we're not there yet. So, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born into sort of that new economic class known as the middle class. His father had been a prosperous farmer. Developed, serfdom was becoming increasingly a thing of the past. And so he was quickly becoming a fairly wealthy man. He wasn't like lavishly wealthy, but wealthy enough, and was sort of a self-made man, and a self-made German man at that. So there's a lot of implications there. Self-made German dads are like the, I built this thing with my two hands, and so you're going to go make something of yourself, right? And that was his father's posture of, I took us from a peasant class and built a life of upward mobility. And so, my dear son Marty, I'm sending you to the university, and you're going to make something of yourself, and you're going to become a lawyer. And I'm going to pay for it, and don't ruin it. And again, we don't know a whole lot about Luther's early life. He's got some biographical things, but it appears as though he wasn't necessarily like an astounding student. And maybe, this is somewhat psychologizing, but it seems like he just kind of wasn't into it. And was wrestling with what seems to be, most of the accounts that we have are Luther telling this later in life, so who knows what's happening, but of him wrestling with guilt and shame, and completely dissatisfied with a lot of the answers. Now, again, I don't think that this would be radically different from many of the students that I had, whose parents were born in one sort of culture and they're being reared in a vastly different one because of the advances in technology. And so the world that their parents understand the world to be is just a different one that they're growing up in. And some of the assumed truths of their parents, now that we have this burst of information and technology, suddenly everything is into question. I think Luther is there. Is Luther the first Gen Zer? Oh, maybe. Some, in fact, would even call him either the last medieval man or the first modern man. But anyway, so Luther, wrestling through, again, much of the uncertainty of the day, finds himself on a stormy day and is terrified of dying, and caught in the midst of this storm, cries out and prays to Saint Anna, if I'm not mistaken, who, somewhat maybe ironically, he writes to his dad and said he prayed out to Saint Anna, who is the matron saint of law and legal studies, which I guess he would have been somewhat familiar with, and said, if I survive this storm, I will join the church. And he survived the storm, and I guess being a man of his word, he did. He joined a group of Augustinian monks. And again, as we talked about in the previous episode, Augustinianism was being constantly talked about at this point. And some of the Augustinian monks of this day, again, we could go way, way, way into the weeds, but they're wrestling through a variety of things. And again, Luther has some assumptions early on, but sticks with it, becomes increasingly interested in theology, eventually finds some favor with the higher powers, the uppers, as it were, and is not only brought into the priesthood, but he receives his doctorate of theology and becomes a professor of theology. And one of the first things that he does is this professor of theology who has some humanistic learning, so he's learned Greek, and he begins to do what was popular and prominent at this time, which wasn't super prominent in the medieval era. You didn't see a lot of lecturing in the great schools on the text of Scripture itself. It was actually more on, again, Peter Lombard's 4 Sentences. So one of the humanistic moves was actually to begin to lecture on the sacred page. And so Luther, one of the first things he begins to lecture on was one of Augustine's favorite things to lecture on, the Psalms. And so a very long time, he will lecture on the Psalms and is starting to wake up to some things. He's, and Augustine says this here, and a lot of time in the text. But later he'll begin to lecture on the book of Romans. And it's at this point that a lot of his assumptions, which even amongst the quote unquote Augustinians of his day was actually a little bit more Pelagian. Backstory there, don't worry about it. Going, boo, some of these assumptions that we've had as Augustinian and trying to be Christian is just not it's just not what the Bible says. The nature of human effort, and Luther will highlight and go into, and kind of the chief of much of his thinking that revolutionizes him is actually the nature of grace, which, to be fair, again, part of the reason why this is important, a lot of Luther's assumptions were initially actually more Pelagian. There's not a huge point of grace because of some of the influences from the later medieval era on Luther. Interestingly enough, if Luther had maybe spent more time reading Thomas Aquinas, then he would have actually had a much more Augustinian view of grace, because Aquinas, especially as far as grace is concerned, is very Augustinian. And so anyway, he's finding himself as he's reading Romans being like, a lot of these things actually are not Augustinian, they're Pelagian, and they're not biblical. And grace is actually really much of the core. And it's also during this time that he sees some corruption within the church. He's a pastor there in the university town, and the corruption, there's a constant grab for money. The corruption with money within the church is rampant. And so Luther will, again, after hearing this, do a very normal thing. During this day and age, again, throughout the medieval era, one of the points of the university, one of the things was disputatio, disputations, people getting up and debating. That was just like an everyday thing. You just do that at the university. You debate theology. And one of the ways, especially as a university professor of theology, one of the ways in which you more or less said, because you couldn't call people up and be like, hey, let's talk this out publicly. One of the ways to do that, to bring a public debate to the floor of the public, you would write up your disputation against certain points of different perspective. And then you would take it to a public place, normally the cathedral door, and nail it up so that your opponents and the people from an opposing party could look and see your argument. Hey, this is what I want to talk about on the main floor of the day. And so Luther, seeing a lot of the things during this time, right around 1517, it has a variety of things that he's like, listen, I've got some disputes and some issues. And so here they are. I've got about 95, which is in that day was not a particularly long list, not a particularly short one either, but just kind of average. And so he does a very average thing on October 31st, 1517, when allegedly at least he nails the 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg. And again, in the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty normal thing to do. Now then, at this point in time, Luther, especially early Luther, has lots of what we would call today Roman Catholic sensibilities. Does Luther in 1517 have an issue with the Pope? No, he does not. In fact, in 1512, he was a delegate to the Pope in Rome and is like, cool, Rome, nice, got it. The Pope, cool, whatever. Does he have developing issues on the nature of the sacraments. Not really. The understanding of penance versus repentance at this point, not particularly. It was mainly on the cell of indulgences. This happens, but it's about money. Hot take. It's about money. And he's saying, hey, I think we're contributing money in corrupt ways. The issue is not money. The issue is not with a wealthy papal state. The issue is not building beautiful, expensive cathedrals of the day and needing money to do that. That's not the issue. The issue is the corrupt way in which we're getting the money. So we need to talk. Which, again, in the grand scheme of things, is not an unusual thing, but it becomes a huge thing. And so the more and more, like, Luther will begin to get pushed back. Now, again, he's starting to pick up some of he's familiar at least with some of the Hussite literature, Jan Hus and John Wycliffe. He's becoming more and more aware of that. He's going deeper and deeper into Augustine, but especially more and more into the page of Scripture. And as he gets pushed back on things, he is responding and going, oh, wait a minute, hang on. But I said this, and now you're saying this, and that wasn't my issue, but now it kind of is my issue. And okay, but hold on, you're just throwing that out. But that's not what Augustine's saying, and I'm positive that's not what Paul's saying. And so what are you talking about? And very quickly, Luther will actually be excommunicated from the church. But again, because economically during this time and sociopolitically, it's also during this time that Muslim forces are knocking on the door of Western Europe. And so most of the forces, and if all the attention had been able to be on Luther and kind of this movement that's developing around him, which is, getting more and more heated all the time, a huge focus and attention was, hey, we've got to keep the Muslims out of Western Europe. So Luther kind of like a little bit gets by. It's also a time where there's a lot of different divisions. And so he's in a particular place that has some sensibilities and some power. And so they're able to do a similar thing that John Wycliffe did, where they're able to say like, hey, just shh, I'm not going to hand you over to the Pope, but my guy, you got to shut up. Okay. We're going to put you, like, hide you away in this castle. You got to stay up here and you got to shut up for a little bit, for crying out loud. You're going to get burned at the stake, my guy. And it's during this time that Luther just keeps going further and further into it. So Luther's years are 1483 and he'll pass away in 1536. But this movement will develop around him. It's interesting that at almost the exact same time, there's some claim that there was no connection, and I think there's at least decent-ish evidence for that. In Switzerland, a similar movement is developing by a guy by the name of Ulrich Zwingli. Zwingli is a Swiss priest. He's educated, we know for sure, at least at the University of Paris. And it seems like in his early days, he is like just very vanilla Catholic. He's not asking a whole lot of questions, but has some humanistic tendencies, specifically whenever he takes up, I can't remember the German word for it, but basically the people's pastor, the folk pastor. During his day, he has some humanistic, so he learns Greek, maybe even Hebrew, and begins studying the text, which was the prominent thing of the day. He's a big fan of really kind of the rock star humanistic scholar of the day, Desiderius Erasmus. Loves Erasmus, and Erasmus will be one of Luther's main opponents. But so he begins studying scripture, and he has this radical idea, Zwingli does one day, instead of sticking with the lectionary, since I'm the people's pastor here in Zurich, what if I just started in Matthew chapter 1 and preached Matthew chapter 1, and then next week I did Matthew chapter 2.
A radical idea.
One of the reasons, and this is a theory, I don't actually have evidence for this, but I think this is maybe true. At this point, Eastern Christian literature is making it to the West, and it's part of humanistic study. I think it was roundabouts this time that John Chrysostom, really probably the greatest preacher in the ancient church, his homilies, his sermons, which are, even almost commentaries, are making it to the West. And it was Chrysostom's regular practice to preach and teach through books of the Bible. And so my theory, and I haven't done a deep enough dive on Zwingli, but my theory is he picks up Chrysostom and is like, well, that just makes sense. And so he starts doing that. And as he does it, he's going, well, hang on a second. This doesn't line up with some of Peter Lombard's stuff and some of the thinking of the day. And well, Jesus was the one that said this. And so maybe Peter Lombard's wrong and Jesus is right. And Zwingli, again, Luther seems to be kind of a radical. Well, maybe not even a radical. Luther seems to be someone who is pretty okay making big statements.
He likes to rock the boat. That's kind of his thing. To your point of
he's pretty okay to rock the boat.
Go over here and shut up, and he's like, no.
I can't. Yeah, I heard a completely different guy, but a fairly well-known theologian, another person talking about this theologian said, yeah, this guy was the sort of guy who, sweetest guy you'll ever meet in your life, especially if you talk to him one-on-one, but is pretpretty okay being the guy who walks into a room, drops a bomb, and then walking out and seeing what happens. Luther was kind of that guy. Zwingli, again, at least from what I can tell, is not quite like that, but when Zwingli does something, he goes all the way. Yep. And so in a way that not even Luther does, Zwingli is more comfortable breaking with tradition. Throughout Luther's life, there are lots of things that we would think of today as being Roman Catholic that Luther probably believed until he died. Some of which even Zwingli held, but the perpetual virginity of Mary, and maybe even the Immaculate Conception. Some of the Marian dogmas, I don't think he would call Mary quite a co-redeemer with Christ, but he was okay with that. Zwingli was too. His views of the sacrament, consubstantiation, is much closer to transubstantiation. And even in the High Middle Ages, if Luther were to come out with his view of the sacraments, I honestly don't think anybody had batted an eye. His view of baptism and Zwingli's view of baptism, at least so far as I can tell, were drastically different. Zwingli seems to be much more okay with the Eastern Church. That'd make a great dissertation if somebody wants to write one day of the Eastern Church's influence on Ulrich Zwingli. But anyway, so at least in belief and practice, Luther is not super radical with, again, the Catholic Church of his day. Zwingli's like, I'll dump it all. I'll walk right out on it. And if it even kind of sometimes smells Catholic to me, again, Roman Catholic or papist, sorry, don't mean to be offensive, but his term. Yeah, I'll dump it in a heartbeat. He even, for a time, Zwingli was actually known before kind of he got on this trail as being maybe the greatest musician in Zurich, sacred music. He was apparently a tremendous organist. And said, yeah, I don't see any warrant for instrumentation or singing in Scripture or in the practice of the earliest church. And so he did not use instruments, musical instruments in worship, and eventually got to where in Zurich he didn't allow him to sing anymore. He could only chant. And that was a practice for a long time in at least Zurich, if not broader in the Swiss Reformation. But anyway, so Zwingli is a little bit more radical in practice. And again, radical in what way? Maybe radical in being drawn to the Eastern side of things, maybe not. But the two of them actually met in 1529. There were others who were picking up, some following Luther, some following Zwingli, some having some nuance and going, we need to unite. Martin Butzer was one, a lesser known guy with a really cool name, Johann Oecolampadius. It's a real name. Can't spell it, but Oecolampadius.
That's why it's not.
That's why it's not here. These are all, in some sense, first generation reformers too. They're all and so they all meet at some point to sit down. Luther's right hand man, who's much less of a potty mouth and seems to be a gentle spirit, Philip Melanchthon, and they all sit down and they're like, maybe we can have a united, the Swiss. There's some Italians coming up here. There was a proto-reformer, I butcher his name, Savagnola or something like that, during right around the Medician era. So there's that even going on in Italy just before Luther. And so there's this whole group of we can have a united Reformation because we've all pretty much been excommunicated at this point. So maybe we can have the Germans, we can have the Swiss, we've got some Dutch guys here, sort of. We've got some Italians, we've got maybe some French. We're all here together. Maybe we can have this united front, but the two kind of grand hooplas of them all are Luther and Zwingli, and they're checking boxes, and they get down to the nature of the Eucharist, and they just can't get on board, and so they break and go their separate ways. And in Germany, there is Lutheranism. There are some who wouldn't call themselves necessarily Lutheran, but are Lutheran adjacent. The German Reformed, which is again a cool group, but then there's the Swiss Reformed and the Dutch Reformed as well. And so they end up breaking. Zwingli, again being Swiss, belonged to a canton that was particularly known. The main industry was actually mercenaries, and was throughout his pastorate was a chaplain to the mercenaries from Switzerland. Well, the papal forces come against Zurich, and Zwingli rides out to battle, something he's well acquainted with. And they end up winning, but Zwingli dies. So he dies in 1531, and Luther again in 1536. And so those are the first, we're calling them first generation reformers on the continent. There are obviously others previously named and more going on there, but it's roughly the same time, but for vastly different reasons. Reformation is going on the British Isles as well. There was a guy there, again, all kinds of things going on in England. You've got the background. Well, before I get there, thoughts on what was happening. I'm talking too much, so I'm so sorry.
No, you're good. There's just a lot to get through. Mm-hmm. I always find the Luther Zwingli thing fascinating. Yeah. I like the way that you've kind of broken down when we get into this kind of third person and the triangulation that kind of happens between what's happening. I mean, the thing I think I kind of keep coming back to with the discussion of the Renaissance and then these two first reformers is in retrospect, it all just kind of feels inevitable. Yeah. Not necessarily the way that it happened, right? Like totally. Some of the political things that happened, the fights between Ulrich and Martin and those kinds of things. But in terms of kind of what we talked about, something had to give and you've got the growth of humanities, and we're studying things differently, and all of this stuff is happening with the Renaissance and technology, and we haven't really talked about the printing press, but like that obviously plays a huge role in what happens just in terms of being able to spread ideas.
Absolutely.
And so all of that kind of happening and getting into this concoction all at the same time. When you look at it now, it's like, well, of course something was going to happen.
Yes.
How could it not?
It was, yes. Yeah.
You know, people getting frustrated with the crusade, like all of that is just like,
it
just all kind of has to come to a head.
It does.
And so it's not very surprising now when you look at it.
Yeah.
And even that it would be happening in these different pockets.
Right.
It's not super surprising to me.
No.
I find the reasoning very funny, and we're about to get into that with Thomas Cranmer and kind of what happens in England. But yeah, I just find it very fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, kind of, especially with this one, the most surprising thing about the Reformation is not that it happened. That shouldn't shock anybody that it happened. Of course it happened and was inevitable. Some sort of grand reform was going to happen in the Western Church. It was inevitable. The shocking thing about it is the way it happened. And it always happened, at least so far as I can tell, almost by accident, but really purely by accident. Luther did a very normal thing as a professor of theology. That was just something that you did. Zwingli was just doing something that he thought this is again theory, but something he thought he had precedent for. And in the grand scheme of things, is not a terrible idea.
Right. A pastor making a decision for his church.
Yeah. Maybe it would be beneficial to preach through books of the Bible, which, by the way, Chrysostom did, which, by the way, Augustine did, and we have both of their stuff. So, I don't know. Let's give it a shot.
Yep.
And both of them, even to their deathbed, viewed themselves not as radicals or as those who are breaking with the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. They were just like, maybe we pushed kind of hard. And maybe this caught some momentum, and maybe we said some things that we could have said better. I hope they thought that, because Luther certainly could have said things better than he sometimes did, particularly about other people. But they didn't view themselves as being radicals. Now, again, almost nobody does, and if you do, then that might be kind of strange. But anyway, so it's not the shocking thing is not that it happened; it's how it happened on the continent. Well, okay. Now then, we're going to swim across the English Channel into the British Isles. Again, you've got Wycliffe and the Lollards going on, century or two before. So there's echoes here, but there's been a fairly close tie after King Edward between the monarchy and the papal establishment. And so England, in some sense, in the early 1600s, is a very papal, pro-papal place. The questioning that was once there is not nearly as kind of prominent as it was even during the time of Wycliffe, though the Lollards are still kind of there. And some of the humanities are growing, particularly at Oxford and its younger brother, again, another hot take, but younger brother, Cambridge. And so at this point in time, we meet a guy by the name of Thomas Cranmer. His years are 1489 to 1556. Eventually, we'll go and study at Cambridge, again, just studying humanities. An educated man, part of that middle class. It's interesting that all three, I know it for sure, at least Luther and Zwingli were from families of that newly developed middle class. I'm almost positive that Cranmer is as well. But we know almost nothing about his early life. So he goes and studies humanities at Cambridge, eventually gets his MA, which required a lot of study. Is tutor there. He teaches for a time, but he falls in love. Oh, love story. Falls in love, and for a very long time, in order to be a fellow, a professor at Oxford or Cambridge, you couldn't get married. You had to be a bachelor. And he falls in love and says, well, I love teaching, but I love her more. So he goes and gets married. And out of, apparently, we know very little about Cranmer's early life, but apparently he was such a highly revered professor that a particular hall, I can't remember what the hall was called. It became Magdalen College, as we say here. But if you're in Oxford or Cambridge, they're at both. Magdalen College, which was then, again, somewhat independent, hired him as a teacher there. So he didn't have to follow the same rules. I think he went to Jesus College, Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, doesn't matter. So marries her, is still teaching at what would become Magdalen College. She gets pregnant, very prominent in the 1500s. She dies in childbirth. And so he is a married man no more. And almost immediately, his previous teaching post is offered back to him. And this time with some kind of upper mobility with it. It's also during this time that he says, I loved her, she's gone. So maybe the priesthood's for me. So he takes up the study of theology at this point in time during his professorship, and is eventually ordained as a priest in 1520, but will remain both a preacher of the university, because they had university churches at this point in time, and a professor for a variety of time. He's a scholar, and is not a revolutionary. We don't know much about him at all during this point in his life. I can't recall, but I don't think he hardly writes anything at this point. And so he's a guy that almost nobody knows anything about. He's obviously studying the humanities, and so he's preparing, he's doing what you do at Cambridge during this time. You're teaching humanities, you're teaching from scripture, you're teaching theology. And some of Luther's literature, which is taking off, it's going viral because the printing press, and that was, right. Luther was a master of media. I think that's why the Luther's movement catches the way that it does, in a way that was just unparalleled during the day. Is Luther's a master of media? He writes in a sort of clickbait fashion sometimes. But Luther, again, I think he was very media savvy. Another tremendous dissertation if somebody wants to write it. Luther and his media savvy. He captures people in his movement because he's also a tremendous hymn writer. And so he gets people singing his hymns, which are very singable, and he sets them to German folk tunes. So people are singing them in taverns, and it catches on, and then he's writing these things. He'll write pamphlets, and they can just, mass produce them overnight and then throw them in the streets, and people are picking them up. And so Luther's media savvy is just off the charts. He just got it. I don't know. It eventually finds its way into Cambridge. A lot of the lollards of this time are saying, "See, told you," and they're still underground, but in and around Cambridge, it's going on. Discussions are happening, after class at, You're getting together at the tavern and at your local local pub, and a couple beers and what about this Luther guy? This is kind of crazy. And so this is going on, but Cranmer really, at his study of humanities, is preparing. It's preparing him to kind of hear some of this and enter into some of the thought process. Well, it's during this time the king at the time, King Henry VIII, famous, infamous, however it may be, wants to pursue a divorce from his wife at the time. Now then, divorce during this time is not illegal and not even necessarily uncommon. It does require papal approval. And again, not something unheard of. Monarchy, you're married to somebody who can't produce an heir for you. An annulment, as it was known. An annulment was it's not super common, but it wasn't unheard of. Was a normal practice. So you have your bishops write to the Pope. The Pope says, sure, especially if you and him are buds, you get your annulment, you move on. The issue is the wife of King Henry VIII has very close ties, I think familially, with the Pope at the time, and would be an utter disgrace to her family. And so when King Henry VIII asks for an annulment, the Pope says, under no circumstance, absolutely not, because me and her dad are golf buds. So no, you can't. Well, King Henry VIII, who didn't particularly have issue with the Pope at this time and comes from a long tradition that was good with the Pope, says, maybe that King Edward guy, the King Edward III, had something to that. I need some scholars who can really do some work and figuring out how to, via church polity, get around this sort of annulment thing. And so somehow, some way, Cranmer's name comes up. And so he begins working with King Henry VIII. It's also during this time, after that, they work on their annulment and he becomes named. But he's more or less a delegate to be sent to the continent to study kind of what's going on. And so he's being brought around to various places within Europe at this time, and not long after, makes contact with Martin Bucer. And Martin Bucer he was a German, again, just a little bit younger than Luther, captivated by Luther's works, but also thought that some of the other reformers of that time, including Zwingli, had some stuff, and so he's almost this middle ground between Luther and Zwingli, and becomes a well-known reformer of his day. Cranmer and he strike up a friendship and become really good friends. In fact, I think at some point Bucer might even go to Oxford or Cambridge for a time. I can't remember. There was another reformer for sure, or a couple. So he strikes up a friendship with Bucer, and his reformed convictions are ever deepening from that moment on. Well, eventually, while he's traveling around with Bucer and some of those other reformers, he receives a letter declaring that he is now the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it takes him by surprise because, again, he's a pretty normal professor, kind of shockingly been sent as this delegate to study what's going on. He's made some friends. He's like, well, this is cool. I'm going to take this back to Cambridge, and this will be great. I'm really happy about that. Oh, by the way, you're now one of the religious leaders in your country, a very high office. With towering names, not the least of which is somebody like Anselm, Saint Anselm of Canterbury, Well, now you're the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and the king needs you back ASAP. Oh boy. Okay. So he goes back, and this is when he starts to get some word of the impending divorce. And so he's working on that more and kind of is putting some final things on it. He wants it to be, Cranmer is not really a guy who strikes me as somebody who likes to shake the boat. He's a normal guy, I think, that wanted to do, normal academic work, serve the church generally speaking, but was not, as kind of brash perhaps as Luther, or as independent-minded per se as maybe Zwingli was. Cranmer was like, let's do. Well, he finds out about 2 weeks later that King Henry VIII had divorced his wife, and Cranmer was like, wait, we didn't say that yet. We were still working on it. And King Henry was like, well, I found somebody that I like, and I'm not waiting. So I divorced her and I married this other lady. And Cranmer's like, oh boy, okay. Well, all right. So with that, now then, you've got the king and you've got this group and you've got a really, really mad pope. And so the pope is exceedingly upset with King Henry VIII and is like, what's up, guy? We're kind of busy again with the Islamic forces, and King Henry VIII has an absolutely massive military. So he's like, I can do what I want. And so then they kind of look around and are like, well, we've basically been cut off from Rome. And King Henry VIII is like, well, okay, it is what it is. We will be the more or less the Anglican Church. Cranmer, figure it out. Put together a team and figure out what will be this new Church of England. Make sure the king is the head of this church. That's the big point. What you do from there, whatever. And so Cranmer really becomes some of the architect of the Anglican Church, developing the Book of Common Prayer, which was to help pastors during this time. Some of the confessional documents that eventually will be part of the Anglican Church's system of beliefs, things like the 39 Articles, actually have very reformed leanings, and you can hear the echoes going on. But Cranmer, for the ball, and again, the English history is like very complex, but Cranmer seems to be a quiet reformer, maybe more diplomatic than many give him credit. And so he's not one for radical breaks or radical statements. And yet here he is kind of becoming this architect of this new kind of Reformation movement, what is now the Anglican Church.
Well, there's a certain kind of irony in that where he's almost handed what Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli are looking for, like on a silver platter. Where it's like he also was not asking for a new church.
No.
But it just kind of happens.
Yep.
And so I think to your point of like, he's kind of this quiet reformer where he's like, he's developing these Reformation ideas. Mm-hmm. And then before he can really even implement anything, it's like, we've broken, we're something new, figure it out. And so he's able to kind of implement some of those Reformation ideas without having to fight and be worried in the same way that, like, say, Martin Luther was.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah. And now it'll be, a short time after, and another Thomas Cromwell, and that's a whole different story. But so anyway, those are really those first generation reformers. Now, a few things that I want to point out as we kind of take all of those as a whole. One, none of them thought what they were doing was radical. Mm-hmm. Two, what we think of as kind of standard medieval theology is still at play. There is probably more so in Luther, maybe to a degree with Cranmer. I think Cranmer really did like a big tent, but Luther being more dogmatic. There's a lot of statements within Luther. They're like that's still just that's medieval theology that we would think of again, and so the kind of differentiation, particularly between Luther and there's debates about early Luther versus later Luther, and some of the development of his dogma, but even early versus late, a lot of the general sensibilities are, generally speaking, things that you can find in earlier Western predecessors. Maybe some of the clarity that he's really hammering home is the manner in which we receive grace. And I think that is the radical idea, if there is a core, and this is an overstatement. I recognize that. But if there is a core, quote unquote, radical idea of the Reformation, it is not grace itself, it's the manner in which grace is received. And in Luther and the Reformers, this is really kind of the main differentiation, is the Reformed believe grace is imputed to us. It's not infused to us, which seems like a very minuscule differentiation. And yet it's that doctrinal differentiation coupled with an utterly chaotic point in history that created the Reformation. And so here we sit today. Now...
Just skip a few hundred years.
Skip a few hundred years. But anyway, so that's the first generation reformers. Interesting
Excellent.
Story, right?
Oh my gosh.
Hopefully you're still with us. Sorry. But yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
Well, we will continue next week.
Yes.
By talking about the next generation
That's
of
right.
reformers. If you have questions, which that was a lot, so maybe you do have some questions.
Probably.
You can
Me
email
too.
keaton.paul@pcazion.org, or you can leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and we'll see you next week.
Tremendous.